about social interaction in VR. And I think the best way to explain it would be to describe you felt a surprisingly strong connection as you talked and met with these people because of how you can see their hands and their head move. And it was honestly, in my opinion, more powerful than even a video call because it felt like you were there with people.
Hello world, this is BetterTech, a podcast where we chat with some of the most successful leaders about the latest industry developments. So join us as we explore the world reliant on tech. This episode is brought to you by tkxel, a leading software development company. Check them out at tkxel.com. Let's explore the huge shifts emerging in the way humans interact with computers and see how close we're coming to a more immersive, interactive future with Alexander Clark, sensor and camera architecture manager at HP and a VR startup founder. So Alexander, first things first, how did your startup StarKid Arcade come about?
It came from a passion for VR as a technology. My business partner and best friend, Brandon, he had a VR headset. We would play it a lot. And because I had a background in programming, we discussed it and said, you know what, we should try to make some content ourselves. We felt there was a void in the market. And so we wanted to try our hand at creating some original content for that platform.
And it seems it's been a great experience so far. So that's the basis of our topic today, how VR is revolutionizing human-computer interaction. And many companies are experimenting with this technology. So what are some of the key areas where VR is set to bring about a revolutionary transformation?
There's two unique ones that I'm becoming increasingly more familiar with. Education and therapy are two that have come up. On the education side, VR, because it's so immersive, it really helps train and teach people what something is like to do in real life. I'll give you an example. In our recently announced game, Virus Popper, it's an educational game about teaching about hygiene and safety, which is a very relevant topic right now. Yeah. The thing most people said when they played it is they didn't realize how long 20 seconds is. But in the game, we actually require a user to wash their hands for 20 seconds. And because they're in that space, it feels more real. And they suddenly start to understand the real impact of how long 20 seconds could be. And that's a simple example, but I think there's other ways that education can be extended and really help people understand a concept better.
Right.
And then the second one that I mentioned was therapy, and specifically, I think neurological therapy has a lot of potential. I was at a social event recently, and I talked to a neurological rehabilitation, somebody who is an expert in that space. And she was telling me about when she works with her different patients that were suffering from brain damage through different accidents that they'd had, and they were trying to build back the muscle memory between their body and their mind. She was actually using VR to help reintroduce them to the world without taking them into an environment that was scary or potentially harmful for them. Like, she would explain that a lot of times her patients would have a hard time going back into crowded malls because they couldn't get their minds to respond as fast to their bodies. And by putting them in a VR headset, it's a safe place for them to practice that hand-eye coordination. And I was absolutely fascinated and thrilled that somebody was using VR in such a unique way.
So this technology is definitely helping them with their rehabilitation journey.
Yes, absolutely.
That's actually pretty interesting. I was not aware that this is another application area of VR.
Yeah, and it's one that I'm becoming increasingly more interested in. There was another person in a similar field of study, and they were telling me about the work with their patients. And specifically, they were dealing with memory loss. And I said, well, how do you improve somebody who's suffering from memory loss or starting to lose their memory? And they said that they have them go through different training exercises of they will hold up flashcards showing different types of objects. And the person has to try to remember the names of these objects.
Right.
And it's something that has probably been practiced and done for a lot of time, but immediately I think the bottleneck in this is one, it's dependent on somebody being there physically showing the cards and walking them through it. And then two, I don't know how like tactual or hands-on flashcards and pictures can be. Whereas I think in VR, there could be an opportunity where if you were to show a virtual object to somebody, then it's much more real to them and it could bring back the memories of what that object was and what its name was. And then you could also automate it too. You don't necessarily need the limited time of a doctor or a therapist. You could have them run through a program. And so I think it's very exciting in the ways we can help people with VR.
I agree, its potential is definitely exciting. So, if you have to put it in very general and concise terms, how is it changing human computer interaction?
It definitely changes how we think about design. When a person's in VR, it's so much more immersive that the expectations are higher. They generally expect to be able to interact with everything, and they want their interactions to feel very intuitive. And so things like buttons, they don't feel appropriate anymore because you're in a space with what seems like real objects that you're supposed to interact with. And the last thing a user wants to do is look down at their hands and try to figure out which button they're supposed to be pressing. We came to this even when we were creating our game Star Blazer. It's a strategy game, and one of the problems we immediately noticed was there's too many controls for a user. When they're in that space, and in this case, the game's like a space sci-fi game, so you're controlling ships, and there's a lot going on. And in general, most users, they felt overwhelmed by the content, and they just wanted to reach out, control ships very simply. There was an intuitive way to do it in their mind that we hadn't yet programmed. And one of our challenges was, okay, how do we make this feel more intuitive? And so we're actually working on a patch right now which reduces all gameplay to a single button. You only ever have to press one button, which is insane because I don't think any other type of game that's been done in 2D could be simplified that much. But in VR, you almost have to do it because people expect it to be more intuitive.
And since you founded a VR startup, what advice would you give to someone who is very new to this field?
Yeah, I would say two things. One was a piece of advice that John Carmack, he was the former CTO for Oculus, he gave at Oculus Connect, and I thought it was so key, very simple but key. He said, if you want to be in the space, then you truly need to be immersed in it, meaning you need to be playing VR content. And he encouraged, it was a group of developers, and he knew the truth that most developers and designers, they get very immersed in their own work, in their own content, but you can't go into a new space like VR with these blinders on. You have to understand what other people are doing in the space, learn from them, grow your own designs. And so he encouraged people like constantly be playing, trying new content. And so I build it in as a part of my schedule. It feels weird to build in like playtime, but it's actually really important because I realized, I need to be trying the other apps, the other games. It's not just about what I'm creating because somebody else may discover a new way of interacting because the space is so new, and we as a VR industry should all adopt it. So that's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing is definitely go for it. You'll hear a lot of naysayers because VR is still growing.
Yeah.
And they'll tell you, there's no money in VR, or the headsets are too expensive. I've heard this more times than I can count. But I'm a firm believer that the technology is still progressing. It's going to take off at some point. And if you are passionate about the technology, then you can't listen to that if you want to be on the cutting edge.
All right, makes sense. And if you were to delve further into this design element, what are some of the difficulties that you faced as well?
Definitely that, I would call it like that neurological overload. There's so many senses being activated when a person is in VR. And I feel like with my games and my programs, we're constantly stripping out features because when somebody is in a VR headset, they're immediately overwhelmed by all of the content. And so you can't throw too much at them. You have to keep it simple, and you have to take a step back and really streamline your designs. And so for us, that was the biggest challenge of figuring out, all right, how do we give users all of the options and all of the gameplay and controls that we want, but do it in a way that shallows the learning curve.
Okay, shifting towards the hardware side of it, many companies including Apple have recently doubled on their R&D for developing better headsets. So what measures are companies taking nowadays to make VR more immersive?
Yeah, I think there's several key examples. I can think of a couple off the top of my head that are worth noting.
Sure.
HTC, for instance, they built in eye tracking into their Vive Eye. And what's interesting about eye tracking is it's a technology that has been around for years, but it never found a true home yet in the PC industry. And so I had some doubts being aware of it until the first time I tried a headset. And that's when I understood that eye tracking has an absolute place in VR because it was so much more intuitive when the program knew what I was looking at, because then it could predict what I'm trying to interact with. And so that's a new type of technology they did to make it more immersive. Another good example would be the knuckle controllers from Valve. So these are controllers that said, all right, we've been having users grip and hold on to buttons, and that's how they would hold objects. But the truth is that's not really intuitive. If you're going to grab an object in real life, you don't grab it by pressing a button, you grab it by gripping. And so they made these controllers that sit on your hands, and you can actually just grip and grab stuff, and it'll change how your hand reacts. And they overdid their system to support that. Yeah, yeah, and it does. It makes it more intuitive. You can reach out and then physically grab stuff with your hands, and that's much more powerful than trying to just click a button and find that button.
Yeah.
But then Oculus took this a step further. They announced that Oculus Connect, they're working on the actual controller-free hands tracking on the Quest. So I don't know if you saw this announcement, but now they can use the cameras on the Oculus Quest to actually track your hands, no controllers required. And so this is like an entirely new level of immersion to where there are no buttons. It can just get the actual posture and your positioning of the hand and use that as interaction.
Wow, no, I hadn't come across this announcement yet.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and I understand scientific data visualization is another application area of VR, like surgical skill training. How is it different from information visualization?
Sure. So I'm not a huge data science guy, but my understanding is a big part of the difference between data visualization and information visualization is informational visualization is more of an abstraction of the data, whereas data visualization relies more on the raw data. Now,
Right.
the information visualization is really interesting in VR because there are many more ways, literally three-dimensional ways, to visualize that data. I saw a good example of this at a VR meetup. It was a NASA researcher, and he had data that you could have looked at typically in a 2D format. He was correlating the different types of patterns between the crews that fly on the ships and their rest time in between trips and coordination, travel, and all these like interpersonal connections between the people working at NASA and on these launch sites. But what he was showing us was that he had built a VR abstraction of it. And by moving the data around and manipulating it with his hands, he's able to see connections that you wouldn't have been able to see if you just were flipping page by page of a 2D format. And I think that's really the unique element that VR brings is not so much the visualization, even though that is unique, it's more the interaction. And once you get that three-dimensional interaction, there's a lot new ways to look at something and to hopefully reach some more insights about whatever data you're trying to analyze.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. So you mentioned earlier how this field is still rapidly growing. So what are some of the key challenges the VR industry faces? Perhaps even some that you've encountered.
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the challenges are being overcome, such as the cost of the technology. That's something that will come down naturally with all new technology. It does.
Mhm.
I think one of the emotional stigmas or things that needs to be overcome for it to really take off is this feeling of isolation. There's with VR, you're fully immersed in a space, but that also means you're closed off from the rest of the world. And for some people, there's a negative perception. Some people look at this and they say, we're all going to be sitting in our, our tubes getting fed nutrients while we're stuck in VR worlds. And they picture a Matrix-like scenario
Yeah.
on the extreme. And then for some people, there's also a feeling of discomfort. Maybe some people don't feel safe putting on a headset and being immersed in this world and so I think these are real issues. Where I think it'll start to be overcome is when we bring in more social experiences into VR, because there's one thing about being immersed in a world yourself and alone in that world versus seeing somebody else in that virtual space. And I think that's really what's going to help overcome that barrier and
Right.
start to break some of that
I hope
stigma.
so. Yeah.
No, yeah, I think a lot of us hope so. Anybody who's like a fan of Ready Player One and the Oasis and those giant immersive worlds where we can all interact hopes we get there someday.
So, in light of the recent coronavirus pandemic, I was just reading that this crisis has opened up a lot of opportunities for the VR industry, especially with the rising remote workforce surge that we're seeing globally. So, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I do think that VR has a lot of opportunities and can even offer unique experiences over a traditional video call. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I managed the camera architecture team at HP, so I can't say anything bad about video conferencing.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that there is something unique about social interaction in VR, and I think the best way to explain it would be to describe my first social VR experience. It was actually doing an interview similar to this when we launched our game Star Blazer. It was for a lady named Vivian and her show called The Hive, and it was on AltSpace, this giant social networking VR platform. And what's insane about this, and this is the first time I would experience something like this, is they did this interview, but the entire interview was done on a virtual stage in VR with VR avatars. And they even had a virtual reality video recorder and somebody taking pictures. And the audience was VR people in avatars.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. And it opened my mind to what was possible in VR. And I think the thing that stuck out to me the most was after the show. Because we finished the interview, we're on this stage, you can see the people in the audience reacting, throwing up their hands. And then afterwards, they said, well, do you want to come down stage and meet some of the people? I said, okay. So we move our virtual avatars down off of the stage and into the crowd. And as you walk through the crowd, the way the program's configured is as you walk closer to somebody, you can hear their voice louder. Like you have to enter within a certain radius to be able to hear their voice. And it brought that experience of being in a social venue and then interacting and meeting somebody for the first time. And even though we all had virtual avatars, you felt a surprisingly strong connection as you talked and met with these people because of how you can see their hands and their head move. And it was honestly, in my opinion, more powerful than even a video call because it felt like you were there with people. With a video call, I still feel like I'm on the other side of a 2D portal. Not with somebody.
Yeah. So hearing this, it seems that there's a lot of potential for VR to be a game changer when it comes to leading remote teams.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think there's a lot of opportunities for more people to work remotely and to do the job from anywhere over the globe.
Right. And Alexander, what trends do you think will define this industry for this decade?
Yeah, I really do believe it's going to be that social interaction. I believe that VR will take off when more and more of the content becomes social based. If it's games, it's about multiplayer. If it's corporate, it's about collaboration. Whenever we see all the different VR sectors move to a social space, then I think that's when it'll spread like wildfire. And there's a lot of players in the industry moving that direction. I know Facebook's working on Horizon and a VR social media platform, and others are definitely looking at it. Of course, AltSpace, the example I just mentioned, is a good example of people who led the way. But I think we'll see more and more of that, and I think we'll see more of the content transform to be more social. And then when we do, that's when VR will be in its renaissance.
And how would you contextualize VR's relation with other Industry 4.0 technologies like artificial intelligence?
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially if we talk about artificial intelligence, I mentioned there's this huge need for VR to become more immersive. Mm-hmm. And being more immersive implies that your environment's also going to be more intuitive. And then having an environment that's intuitive implies a certain amount of inferencing about what the user is going to do or the context of what they're trying to do. And in order to be able to make an environment or a virtual world that responds exactly to a user like they would expect, you have to draw on a bit of AI and prediction to understand what they're trying to do. And so I think you'll see these virtual worlds are going to be laced with AI that's predicting and inferring just how people are trying to react and interact with the environments so that it delivers the right experience.
And you're right, that's the key. And what about the future of extended reality? How do you think VR will be impacted?
Yeah, mixed reality and extended reality is really interesting because let me give an example of where mixed reality played a huge factor in my company. We were struggling for the longest time to show the gameplay of our game Star Blazer. Okay. It was something that it didn't capture well in videos. You could see ships flying around, but it didn't really stand out from like a 2D game because it wasn't clear how a user played it in VR. And then there's a software called Live that does mixed reality capturing. So in this case, it's where it's capturing a live person and how they would look in real life, and then interweaving them into a VR environment. And it captures videos. It's how a lot of the streamers do the different mixed reality videos on Twitch and YouTube. And it was a huge epiphany for us and a huge aha, because that's when we realized this is what people need to be able to visualize the actual gameplay and what it's like to be in VR for somebody who's never been in it. So that was huge from a mixed reality perspective. And then augmented reality will definitely be huge as well. And I think one of the keys with augmented reality is everything that the developers learn by developing a virtual reality, they can take into AR. And I think there will be a very natural transition there, right, because you're just stripping away some of the environment and then building in other parts of it and blending the two.
And as you mentioned at the beginning, that education and therapy are two areas where VR is being increasingly applied. I'm very interested to know, what are some of the other industries that you feel will benefit from VR adoption going forward?
Yeah, I think we've seen some industrial applications start to take off. There's definitely a lot of focus on the training. As you mentioned, collaboration for the remote work. I have no doubt that'll come at some point. I don't know what the missing factor is there of why that experience hasn't been fully nailed, what needs to be overcome there. But I think once somebody makes an experience that rivals what somebody feels they can do over video or over a phone call, then people will crave it and gravitate towards that.
Right, makes sense. So that's all we have for time today. Thanks, Alexander, for joining us.
Great, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode by BetterTech. If you enjoyed this podcast, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to share it across your favorite social networking platform. We look forward to bringing you the latest industry news in our next episode. In the meantime, take a look at our other episodes and hit subscribe with the links in the description box below so that you don't miss out on the latest in tech.